Welcome to the 411 on texting policies, staying up to date in 2022. We are Mongoose. More specifically, I'm Greg Bauk, the content production manager here at Mongoose. Erin, please introduce yourself to the world.
I'm Erin Carr. I am the client success manager for the Cadence Text team here at Mongoose.
Erin, I've been a best man at a wedding once in my life, and that means you have to do a speech. When I did it, everyone was like, well, what are you going to do for your speech? And I said, I'm just going to wing it. And winging a best man speech is a lot like texting students without a texting policy. It went bad.
Is that it?
Always have a plan is the point I'm trying to make. The people at that wedding, they're scarred for life. Me, I can educate America in saying that when you're texting students, you should have a texting policy. It's a good lesson. Always start with the plan, because texting is a very powerful tool. It is very effective in engaging with students, but only if you have a good plan. Mm-hmm. What is a texting policy? A texting policy is basically a framework. It sets up and answers questions that you're going to have to answer the entire time you're texting students. Who is going to text? How many texts are you going to send a week? What happens if something goes wrong with the text? All of these questions can be answered when you set up that framework for a texting policy to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's so important too to really think critically and ask yourself some questions before you get started of what are your goals? What do you want to accomplish with texting? Are you hoping to, let's say in your advancement department, solicit X amount of donations, or perhaps in your admissions department, are you hoping to increase enrollment? Whatever those goals are should really follow the rest of your texting policy here. That's really, I would say, step one in determining and continuing creating a really successful texting policy.
Because it's about saving your department time. So what are we going to talk about in this webinar? We're going to go through a number of things, collecting texting consent from students and how important that is, and how things have been changing because the world is changing. Opt-out language and best practices when acquiring opt-outs. Regulations like the TCPA and FERPA, two very important acronyms we'll go over. And Erin and I are going to get a little bit into best practices, crafting texts that are effective in engaging students, and best practices for that to reach students and alumni. Mm-hmm. First thing I want to talk about is establishing goals. That's the most important thing, as Erin just mentioned. If you have a goal to begin with, all of those questions are usually answered as you go. Before you establish your goals, one of the important things to do is to get input from everyone, specifically people who are going to be doing the texting. Because if you don't do that and you go forth and establish your texting policy, you're just going to have to go back and get edits from people when you're fine-tuning all of those processes, especially if you are texting on an enterprise level where cross-departmental texts happen. You don't want to be bombarding students with texts from the financial aid office and from admissions. You want to make sure that you have a plan so students are being bombarded with texts from different departments.
Yep, I think that's a great point, Greg. The only thing that I'll just add to that is, of course, those enterprise licenses. It is crucial that you do have a texting policy, but it doesn't just have to be for enterprise licenses here. You really are able to create a texting policy for any department that you have. And it really is super important that the goals are set out, especially because texting is such a personalized medium. Folks are going to be doing things on their own. You're not going to be able, from a communications and marketing perspective, approve every single message that is outgoing to students just because you're going to be constantly fielding responses. So all of that to say, be really thoughtful about what you want your staff to be doing with texting. Your policy is an excellent place to start, whether that's just for one department or team or across the entire enterprise.
And you'll recognize a theme with our presentation here today, and that is plan ahead. Mm-hmm. So if you are texting an enrollment at your school, and that's the only plan you want to do, you establish that texting policy. What that does is it makes it much more easier down the road if different departments want to text to follow that guideline, to step in line with your department and with all the departments across campus. So plan ahead. You might only be texting in one department to begin with, but that can grow as time grows. And having that texting policy, it's such a great framework. It's such a major road with which to add other intersections as you progress at your institution.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point too. Even just to continue down that path, we here at Mongoose have seen just a really high increase in folks adding on additional teams and departments within Cadence, which of course is our two-way texting platform. So even keeping that in mind, when you do set this expectation ahead of time, it does make it so much easier to expand when the expectations are already known and folks are already on the same page about how texting is going to be utilized.
We're going to talk about changes in 2022 that make this that much more important. But first, the reason we're all doing this is to make sure your school is compliant and you don't have carrier violations, and that the texts you're sending are reaching your audience. That's important. But also that audience is being helped. That's super important. And the one thing you don't want to do before you start texting is scare your students away from texting to begin with. You don't want to hit students the wrong way right off the bat with text, because your text will be, what is that beautiful 4-letter word that starts with S and ends in M?
Spam.
Spam. You don't want your text to be spam. Isn't that right, Eric?
I got that one right. I'm impressed with myself.
It's on Wordle. We did a live Wordle for the webinar. It's only 4 letters, but
how amazing.
First guess, 1 out of 6. Make sure you post that on your social.
I love it. But you're spot on here, Greg. I think, as we talked about, that first component is really establishing your goals. But after that point, consent really does have to be the first item that is discussed. And to Greg's point here too, consent is becoming more and more important, especially as we go into 2022. We have seen some really crazy changes with carriers, and this is not just something that affects Mongoose and Cadence. This is something that affects everyone. So another thing just to encourage you on too is whether you, or perhaps you don't have a texting platform that you're using yet, I would really encourage you to, if that's something that you want to do, to vet the folks that you are going to work with, because it is becoming so easy to be blocked and to even be blacklisted. We had seen this, I would even say a couple years ago, but now this is just really happening more often than not. And there are certainly some things that you can do to help mitigate that. And the first would be consent and how we collect that.
Yeah, texting is a technology. Technology seems to take off. And with any technology out there, people get a handle on it and they start using it and they find their own way to use it. And usually compliance and governance catches up later. That's what's happening with texting as texting evolves, and these, texting platforms like Cadence become powerful. They reach so many students. Those violations might happen if certain people using texting platforms, even on a commercial basis, aren't using them correctly. Mm-hmm. I'm going a long way to say that governance is kind of I'm going a long way to say that governance is catching up to protect the consumer, and in our case, the students. They're making sure that students aren't spam. The Wild West is being kind of corralled a little bit by carriers. Therefore, in the past, we would say, well, it's best practices. You should definitely gain consent before texting students. But from a legal standpoint, you don't have to if you're a nonprofit institution. There's certain ways, there's certain parameters that aren't legally binding, but it's a best practice. We're kind of going further along here at Mongoose and saying that, yes, consent is definitely something you have to do.
Yep, I think that's a great way of phrasing that too, in terms of legally, this is the bare minimum. However, we here at Mongoose and really all across the board, you're going to have to fulfill this next level of really just best practices. So kind of going down that path here, how do we obtain consent? What does that mean? So really consent is getting a student's permission to text them. So that can take the place in a variety of different methods and formats. Traditionally, we see this most often on the admissions side of things, where a student perhaps fills out a form or they submit their application, and when there's that little box that says mobile number, lots of folks and institutions will include some verbiage below that really just asks for consent. It encourages students to check off that box to receive messages, and also details what types of messages students will be receiving from this particular department.
When you're obtaining consent and gaining a student's permission to text them, we like to say there are 4 things you should be making very clear to a student when you do that. Those 4 things are making sure that you let students know what messages they will be receiving, what types of messages they will be receiving. For instance, informational messages, messages that help them know about deadlines, messages that help them know that they're going to be missing forms. Make that very clear right off the bat. Let students know what kind of messages they're going to be receiving. The second thing we like to let people know that they should be letting students know when they gain consent is how many times you are going to text a student. Some kind of gauge on the regularity of text. Are you going to be texting students once a week? Are you going to be texting students every day, once a month? Set the parameter right off the bat that makes the expectation there. It helps prevent students from opting out of your text if they know that expectation right off the bat. You get that buy-in. So that's a very important step. For compliancy concerns, you want to make sure that you're providing a place to collect a valid phone number from a student. And the fourth thing is that you want to log it for compliancy issues to make sure that you're in compliance. Know that, track when that opt-in was recorded, and include a date and time if possible.
That last piece is so critical about tracking the opt-out status. It is becoming more clear that at any time, folks who are, or I should say third-party providers who are actually triggering the messages to be sent, what could happen at any time is some of those third parties could come to us and say, hey, we need institution X's, all of their opt-out information in terms of when it was collected, how it was collected, when were they asked again, when they opted out, perhaps via the texting platform or whatever that may look like. So just to drive that point home, that last piece is really critical. And then of course, updating that opt-out permission. So, we talked about that admission side of things, but perhaps then the student enrolls. We then would want to again check their opt-out preferences, as they may have changed, or perhaps they may have opted in again, perhaps when they were opted out before. This is all something that within the Cadence platform too, we do a really great job of facilitating, because in each team that you have within Cadence, you are able to track your opt-out separately. So there's no kind of cross-departmental friction, perhaps is the best way of phrasing that,
sure.
Where information is, perhaps changing when a student goes from one phase to the next.
Friction's always bad. This is a lot. I'm glad this is recorded so you can rewind and listen to us talk again. I know I'll be doing that several times. It's a lot of information. An important note, we mentioned our texting platform. Also with Mongoose, we're always on top of this compliance thing. We have you'll have a designated client success lead helping you through this process. We like to stay on top of these things and pay attention so your institution can always be compliant. So just a shout out to the Mongoose client success team that they're always on top of things for their schools in terms of compliance and best practices and everything.
Absolutely. The last thing, for whatever it's worth here, that I just want to add in terms of Mongoose and what we stand for. Our philosophy, especially in the client success team, is client love, which I know sounds so fluffy, and I'm sure you all are thinking, what the heck does that even mean? But for us, it really is, this compliance thing is a great way of showing that, in terms of we really care about our schools. We want to make sure that folks are leveraging the Cadence platform to the best of their ability, and really just texting in a really effective way. We're on your team. We like to always say that we're anti-vendor in that sense too. We are a partner of yours. We're here to help, and this is just one of the ways that we do that.
There are some ways to do it even just in a phone conversation. For instance, for advancement teams, when receiving gifts from donors, you could be on the phone with the donor and you'll want to text them information, perhaps a link to give. You can just ask, I have your phone number, is it okay if I send you a link in order to send you this gift? That is consent. That actually happens conversationally on the phone. That is a form of consent.
Yep, that's a great point. Another way to do this too is even in a chatbot. Perhaps you're chatting with a specific student, perspective, current, whatever the case may be, or even a parent. And whether it's live chat or even just going down kind of some flows and some bot information, that's also a really great conversational way to officially obtain consent there as well.
Opt-outs, that's very important. You always want to give the student a chance to opt out and the opportunity. And as soon as the student wants to stop receiving text from you, you want to make sure you comply with that right off the bat and opt out students.
Yeah, so just as we were talking about that express consent, that has to happen. But kind of part two of this is when you are texting a student for the first time, you are going to want to include opt out language. So something that even says text stop to opt out, that would be a great way of doing that. I know in Cadence, the way that we track our opt-outs is, those hard type of opt-outs on that carrier level, just like we were saying with those trigger words. But we also, within our platform, have the ability to, let's say, a student texts back and says, please stop texting me. that doesn't necessarily trigger any of the trigger words that we just mentioned. So in that case, we can even opt out students on the cadence side of things as well. So there's lots of different ways to do that specifically with our platform, but nonetheless, we're really going to want to make sure that we ask the student upon receiving that first message to opt out if they need to.
Any school up and ready to start sending texts to students would cringe at the idea of opt-outs, because if you give them an opportunity to opt out, they're often going to take that opportunity to opt out. With the way things are working today, you do want to stay compliant, so you do want to present that opportunity. The way to combat that, I would say, is just to make sure that your texts are delightful and helpful. Every time you send a text, ask, is this actually helping a student? And if so, you'll find out that you do not have a lot of opt-outs if you are giving students what they need in order to help them. So the way to combat opt-outs is just to make sure that your texts aren't something that you would want to opt out. Make sure that you're sending them on a basis that is not overload. You're not sending too many texts, and make sure that every single text you send is helpful.
The only thing I'm going to add to that too is personalization. It is so critical. I know personally, if I were to get a text that said something like asterisk, 50% off sale, go and click this link, or whatever the situation was, I'm not going to respond. I'm not going to engage. However, when you are doing something like saying, hi, first name, it is, Aaron from the admissions team at Mongoose University, you're already setting yourself up in a really personalized way that engages with the student. Of course, there's several other best practices that we can talk about there too, in terms of ending with a call to action. To your point, Greg, making sure that, conversations and your texts are actually actionable. I feel like I'm saying that was a bit of a tongue twister, but
you're doing
nonetheless, those things are really critical and important. And as we even talked about earlier, those are one of the benefits that you get with having a client success lead here too, in the sense of we're going to help guide you through all of that.
Yeah, personalization is key. Use your data for personalization. The more you know your audience, the better questions you can ask to make sure that if they need help, you're helping them.
Yep, and the last thing, there's things that just keep coming to my mind here. I get so excited about this.
Erin's very excited about texting policies.
I love them. But the last thing that's just on my mind here too is I always encourage every institution that I work with, just pause before you hit send and consider, would I respond to this? I feel like 9 times out of 10 institutions are of the mindset of, okay, my marketing team told me this, we have to do this goal has to be met, they need to know about this event. And all of those things are good and helpful. However, just take a moment and consider, would you enjoy receiving this message? If the answer is no, go back to the drawing board, and that's okay.
Part of making sure a student wants to receive the message that you're sending them is to make sure that they're the right audience for that message. Your institution could have hundreds of students, it could have multiple thousands of students. And that means you'll have many audiences, so even within a department. So you want to segment your text, segment your audiences, making sure that the text you're sending are only relevant to the people receiving it.
Yep, absolutely.
Erin, let's talk acronyms. And when we're talking about compliance, the acronyms start flying. 2 very important ones for this presentation are, of course, the TCPA and FERPA. Of course, communications that happen through an algorithm, not through a segmented list or manual contact selection, are prohibited without consent from the recipient. That is the TCPA. For FERPA, that focuses on privacy as it relates to student educational records. 2 very important acronyms when it comes to remaining compliant.
One additional item just to add in terms of TCPA and FERPA is you really should never be sending personalized information in terms of things like social security number or, financial aid, critical information, things that you would not want to perhaps get in the wrong hands of someone else. You should never be sending any of that via text.
You can use the text as a setup to finding the way to communicate that information. Hey, I just sent you an email. Here's a telephone number to call. Like a text nudge can lead to the exchange of that information, but you don't want to send that kind of information via text.
Yep. So you should never be asking for social security number for FAFSA information or anything along those lines. So with that said too, Cadence is not your CRM. So that's just another thing to keep in mind in this. And really, most of your texting, if it's an additional add-on tool, they are not going to be your CRM either. So what I mean by that is this information really should never even be stored in Cadence in the first place. You can always reference whatever your system of record is, but we should never be housing things like social security number or any important information within Cadence as well.
We talked about using text as setups, and that leads us to a question we get all the time here at Mongoose, and that is about links.
Yeah.
And links, compliance, texting policy, they're all grouped in together. It's a very important thing because sometimes sending links can lead to carrier violations and unsent text, which are the worst. So we want to talk about using links and whether or not you should be doing that, because we work with more than 700 institutions, and some of those institutions have no problem sending links. Some institutions sometimes might have problems sending links. We've instituted best practices to help make sure that the text that you send actually reach your audience. And with the link, there's ways around sending links, and there's a proper way to do it.
Yep. So there's lots of moving parts with the link sending, especially as carriers are continuing to crack down on messages that have spam, or that look like spam, I should say. So with that said, there's a couple best practices that you can follow to help your link have a greater deliverability. Now, to Greg's point, you always have a risk. We have institutions that send links all the time and have been totally fine. We have others who sent a link once and have been blocked and flagged for a carrier violation. So yes, while we're sharing these best practices with you, there is always going to be a risk. So especially as it pertains to texting policies, your institution wants to be on the same page about if you are willing to take that risk or not. So with that said, the best practice that we have is to send your link via Smart Message. Now, Smart Message is a tool within Cadence that allows you to ask your contacts for a yes or no reply. And as long as they text back within a 24-hour window, which most folks do, they will automatically receive the yes reply that you type out, and same thing with the no reply. So the reason why we recommend this best practice is because as I'm sure you can imagine, when you're sending one link across or to multiple individuals, carriers are going to see that and are going to get suspicious. So if you can narrow down that population that you're sending your link to only the folks who are interested in receiving it, it really helps with that. The one other thing I'll just add here too is we always want to use a full link, never a shortened link. Shortened links, again, as I'm sure you can imagine, would often lead to carriers perceiving your message as a spam.
Another great best practice that we always tell schools is to use email in conjunction with text, specifically with sending links, because links and emails are never a problem. So use it in conjunction. Use that text as a nudge. Hey, I just sent you a link to the place to complete this form. It's check your email, and that text will go and lead that student or alumni member to the email to follow that link. So using text in conjunction with email and phone calls and every other form of communication that you have, we call that omni-channel. Super important, super effective, and a good workaround from texting links.
I think that's such a great point here too. The omni-channel just conversation. That's part of the reason why you have a texting policy too, right? That's why we want to make sure that we're using everything in conjunction with one another, because texting is not the end all be all. While it's super successful, we also don't want to burn out the medium. So that's why we have to use all of these other channels together, and even to go along with the compliance aspects as well.
Macaroni and cheese is great. You just can't eat it at every meal.
Speak for yourself.
Well, you can. You're going to have to see a doctor eventually. Aaron, let's talk about emojis. Everyone loves them, and if you're creating a texting policy for your school, when you're sitting down and you're talking about when to text, what to text, this question should come up. Should we be using emojis? So that answer is going to be per institution. You know your audience better than Aaron and I know your audience, so you know what would be effective and what would not be. What we do find with the institutions that we work with, that emojis are very effective, and that all audiences, post-traditional, alumni, prospective students, everyone reacts well to emojis, and they add a bit of fun and they increase engagement.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think here there are several different use cases and examples, but my favorite to kind of highlight in terms of emoji usage is when institutions take the opportunity to check in with their students, especially at a particularly stressful time. Perhaps that's during finals, during the first week of classes, whatever it may be. Sometimes we'll see institutions send out a message that says something like, "Hi, first name, it's your advisor or admissions counselor. Just want to check in with you. How was your first week? React with your favorite emoji." And we see response rates go through the roof with messages like this. And they're so fun. It's such a great way to engage with your contacts. So it's just a really creative way to leverage that.
And two ways to get started too. If you're not sure about emoji usage, you don't want to overdo emojis. Never send a text with 17 emojis. I don't care if emojis have been super effective for you, if it's the 1,000th text you've sent or the first text you sent. limit your emoji usage. So in the beginning, smiley faces, a very safe emoji, a thumbs up emoji, very safe emoji to use. If I see that in my preview screen and I'm an alumni to your school or a student at your school, it is something that catches my eye and is a friendly, engaging message. So emojis are very effective in a text, but test it first with some safe emojis. So what's a safe emoji? We always recommend using Emojipedia. Emojipedia.org as a great link to go to. Checking through emojis, there's information there on what emojis mean, because certain carriers, certain phones, certain emojis appear differently on different phones. So you always want to make sure you're sending the correct message, and that's a great resource to use to kind of research the emojis that you're using.
Mm-hmm. And where this comes to fruition with your texting policy is we've seen some institutions' policies where they actually list out every marketing approved emoji that you are able to use as a Cadence user. So it's just one way to kind of facilitate that, and of course add that extra touch of personalization while still putting some parameters and some guardrails around it. Perhaps the beer emoji isn't always the most appropriate. There could be a use case that it is, so I'm not going to knock it, but at the same time, just from a professional setting, we want to make sure that we are being personal but also professional at the same time.
And we can put this disclaimer on every point we've talked about now. The work you do ahead of time is going to just save you so much more time down the line, because when you're sending a text and you have a plan to begin with, you're not thinking about what to write. Mm-hmm. You're just crafting the message, and it makes it so much more effective. The time you spend instituting your texting policy is going to save you time down the road.
Yeah. Speaking of that point, another thing that I just want to highlight here is, especially with our enterprise institutions, but also, again, this applies to whether you're just texting in one department or team here too, you really want to make sure that you have some way of tracking who is sending messages when and to what student population, to ensure that you're not burning out the medium. We've given tons of best practices here in terms of personalization, emoji usage, consent, all of those important pieces. But just to add on to that, having some sort of, whether it's a Google Sheets or some other piece of, or some other tool, I should say, that is leveraged internally, just to make sure that, several students across multiple different departments aren't consistently getting the same message. I feel like especially this is relevant with teams like advising and registration, or the registrar's office, I should say. Those are two teams in particular that I see lots of overlap with. Financial aid, I would even venture to throw that one in the mix there too. So really making sure that there's a spot to communicate that in writing, and to ensure what your policy might be regarding who sends a message when. If two teams want to send out a message on the same day to the same population, who wins? And I know that sounds wrong, like, who wins the argument, but really which one takes priority and precedence in that situation. So those are just important things to measure. And I know Greg's about to talk about this here in just a moment as well. But especially for those enterprise institutions, and if you're texting over more than one team or department or student population, you really are going to want to make sure that you meet internally. I personally like to do this with my clients about once a quarter, maybe even once a month, depending on how many messages they're sending out and how siloed their institution is. But it's so important to share best practices. I know for one institution that I have, for example, they have 4 campuses that are all leveraging Cadence, and we meet quarterly where everyone gets an opportunity to share, oh, hey, I sent out this message and I did this. And I remember even in one of those meetings, an admissions team in another campus shared some information about smart messaging, and even our tool auto reply that we have too. And another campus was able to take that and run with it and saw some really excellent success just by doing that. Another example that I'll just put out here too is Bulk MMS, which is our mass photo sending tool. There is an additional charge for that here at Mongoose, but nonetheless, it's a really excellent way to engage in a really personalized way to your students. So even using those types of meetings to talk about those things, those best practices for sending, your favorite office GIF or whatever the situation may be, it's just a really cool way to engage and make sure that everyone is aligned.
So talking about a texting policy isn't all doom and gloom. It's not all compliance, do this, do not pass go, do not collect $200. Like, it's not all doom and gloom. It really is a community on your campus to make sure that not only are you staying compliant, but also using the tools that you have correctly in order to help students. And like Aaron said, when you have those meetings, you establish a plan, but it doesn't end when you establish a plan. When you keep meeting, when you're talking cross-departmental and sharing those best practices and what's working when reaching students, you can share those ideas and make sure that your entire campus is thriving. Boy, this was so much information. If only people had like a guide, like a template for a texting policy.
If only.
They do.
Where do you think they could get that, Greg?
Right here from we at Mongoose. We have a document. It's a texting policy template that we've created. Obviously, every institution is different. When you look at this document, you're going to find that it really is a great start to starting your texting campaigns and making them successful. And even if your school already has a texting policy in place, this is a good gauge to make sure that you're covering all your bases. So that's available to you. If you want to pick up our texting policy template, it is free. All you have to do is send us an email. So this is a virtual conference. We can't just hand it to you because this happened beforehand. You can email Aaron and I and get that. Just send a quick email to greg@mongooseresearch.com, as you see right there, GREG, Aaron, ERIN, @mongooseresearch.com. Send us an email. We'll quickly send you this texting policy template for your school to use for free. And I think that's really cool.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Greg. This was super fun. Yeah. Thanks everyone for chiming in here. And of course, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to email us, contact us, whatever works best for you.
All right. Thanks.